Charlotte is 34 years old, disciplined, competent, and deeply respected in her professional environment. She has built her life carefully, step by step, without great impulses or hasty decisions. She has always believed that maturity meant responsibility, and responsibility, for her, meant keeping everything under control. Her bills are paid. Her routine is organized. Her commitments are fulfilled. For many years, this structure was enough for her to feel secure. From the outside, her life seems stable. She has a steady income, lives in a comfortable place, maintains predictable habits, and doesn't live under the weight of uncontrolled debt. Charlotte has never been reckless with money and has always prided herself on not depending on anyone to maintain her standard of living. At many times, she even thought that this, in itself, was freedom. However, in recent months, something had begun to stir within her in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. It wasn't an obvious crisis, nor a dramatic dissatisfaction. It was a more delicate and persistent feeling, as if a part of her was ready to expand, but didn't know exactly where to begin. She began to feel that she was prepared for a new level, a new phase, something that would require more courage and more intention than simply maintaining what had already been built. It was in this state of silent restlessness that three ideas began to frequently surface in Charlotte's mind. The first was a specialization course that could reposition her professionally and open doors she had always wanted to explore, but which required a significant investment. The second was the desire to travel alone for a few weeks, not for superficial tourism, but to reconnect with herself and reorganize her vision of the future. The third was even bolder, to consider a career change, a move she had been considering for years, but always postponed, arguing that it wasn't the right time yet. None of these ideas were impulsive or irresponsible. They were all consistent with the woman she was becoming. They all represented growth, expansion, and awareness. However, on a seemingly ordinary night, Charlotte decided to open her computer and look at her numbers honestly. She needed to understand if those desires were merely distant possibilities, or if they could, in fact, be transformed into concrete decisions. Upon carefully analyzing her finances, something began to become clear. She wasn't in crisis. There was no chaos, no lack of control, no emergency, but there was also no margin for error. Her income efficiently sustained her current routine, but it didn't create room for larger adjustments. Any decision involving risk, transition, or, more substantial, investment would compromise the security she had always prioritized. If I chose the course, I would have to drastically tighten my budget and forego any unforeseen expenses. If I chose the trip, I would risk the savings I had set aside for emergencies. If you decided to change fields, you would face months of financial instability that simply weren't accounted for in the structure you've built over the years. Charlotte remained silent for a few minutes after closing the spreadsheet. There was no despair in that scene, nor a dramatic breakdown, but there was a realization she could no longer ignore. For the first time, she understood that she had organized her life to sustain the present, but never to expand it. Her financial structure was efficient at keeping everything running, but it didn't create room for bigger moves. For years, she believed that stability was synonymous with freedom. She paid her bills, avoided excessive risks, kept everything under control, and, in a way, that was maturity. However, that night, Charlotte understood something deeper. Stability guarantees security, but it doesn't guarantee choice. She wasn't limited by a lack of intelligence or ability. She was limited because she never built up enough room to maneuver with peace of mind. And upon realizing this, something within her began to change. Because perhaps money was never about luxury or ostentation. Perhaps it was always about having the real possibility of deciding the next step without financial fear, dictating the path. If this insight resonates with you in any way, stay with me in this video, because in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the silent way many women experienced maintenance mode and why it seems safe, but often prevents any real growth. And if this kind of conversation makes sense for your current life situation, subscribe to the channel and like this video so we can continue exploring topics like maturity, self-discovery, and female freedom. What Charlotte realized that night is not uncommon. In fact, it's more common than most women admit. There's a silent way of living that seems responsible, mature, and even admirable, but which, little by little, limits any real possibility of growth. This way can be called maintenance. Living in maintenance mode means organizing your life so that nothing goes wrong. It means working diligently, paying all bills on time, avoiding excessive risks, and maintaining a predictable routine. At first glance, this seems exactly what is expected of a mature and conscious woman. And, in fact, there is merit in that. Discipline and stability are important achievements. The problem arises when the entire financial structure is designed only to sustain the present and never to expand the future. Many women learn from an early age to be responsible, but not necessarily to be strategic. They learn to save, but not to invest. They learn to avoid debt, but not to build wealth. They learn to keep everything running, but not to create room for growth. The maintenance mode is comfortable because it reduces the anxiety of the unpredictable. It offers a sense of control. However, it also creates a subtle illusion that stability is the endpoint of financial maturity. And it isn't. Stability is a start. Freedom demands something more. When all income is committed to fixed expenses, when every major decision depends on sacrificing one's own security, when any change represents excessive risk, there is no true choice. There is only adaptation to what is already established. This doesn't mean the woman is failing. On the contrary, often she is competent, dedicated, and intelligent. What she lacks is not ability, but the intention to build. She lacks the ability to transform money from a means of survival into a tool for leadership. The maintenance mode also hides behind rational justifications. Now is not the time. I need to wait a little longer. It's better not to risk it. These phrases seem prudent, and sometimes they really are. But when they become permanent, they begin to shape an entire life based on preservation, not expansion. There is a profound difference between avoiding irresponsible risks and avoiding any possibility of growth. The first attitude is maturity. The second is often fear disguised as common sense. And this is where mindset starts to matter more than salary. Because two women can earn exactly the same amount and live completely different realities. One organizes her income to sustain the month. The other organizes her income to create future options. The difference lies not only in the number, but in the intention behind each decision. Maintenance mode keeps life stable. A builder mindset creates freedom. And as long as this difference is not understood, many women will continue to believe they are safe, when in reality, they have only learned to live within an invisible boundary. Once the concept of maintenance mode becomes clear, an inevitable question arises: why do intelligent, capable, and disciplined women remain in this pattern for so long? The answer rarely lies in a lack of information. Today, there is abundant content on finance, investments, financial organization, and professional growth. What truly differentiates those who build freedom from those who merely maintain stability is something deeper. The mindset that underpins each financial decision over the years. There is a silent difference between earning money and building freedom with money. Earning money requires technical skills, dedication, and effort. Building freedom requires vision, intention, and tolerance for strategic discomfort. Many women learn to work hard, but they don't learn to think strategically about expansion. The survival mindset is relatively easy to identify. It appears when someone struggles to pay basic bills and lives under constant pressure. However, there is a second, much more subtle mindset that often goes unnoticed. The maintenance mindset. In this mindset, there is no obvious chaos, but there is also no intentional growth. The person learns to manage what comes in and what goes out, but does not organize their own life to create room for maneuver, opportunity, and choice. The mindset of building a life is different. It stems from the understanding that money is not just a resource for consumption or immediate security, but a tool to expand future possibilities. Those who develop this mindset begin to make decisions thinking not only about the current month, but about the coming years. They start asking not only how much can I spend, but how much can I allocate to create freedom? This change may seem small in theory, but it is profound in practice because it requires giving up immediate rewards to consolidate decision-making power for the future. It requires learning financial skills that may never have been taught before. It requires taking full responsibility for one's own growth without waiting for ideal circumstances. It also requires confronting a significant internal discomfort, the fear of making mistakes while trying to grow. Many women remain in maintenance mode not because they lack ability, but because they fear losing the stability they have achieved. And this fear is understandable. Stability was built with effort. The problem is when the desire to preserve it prevents any movement toward expansion. A wealthy mindset is not synonymous with ostentation, impulsive consumption, or excess. It is related to the ability to think long-term, to invest in oneself, to transform income into wealth and wealth into freedom. It is related to the awareness that every financial decision is, in fact, a decision about the kind of life that will be possible to live. Charlotte began to realize that her limitation wasn't in the amount of money she received, but in how she organized her own future. She had always been disciplined in maintaining her income, but never strategic in expanding it. And this realization didn't diminish her. On the contrary, it opened up a new possibility, because mindset is something that can be developed when a woman understands that financial freedom begins with how she thinks, and not just how much she earns. She ceases to be a hostage to her current structure. She begins to intentionally create space for greater choices. And it is at this point that money ceases to be just a number and begins to provide direction. Charlotte began to realize that the problem was never just money, or just her career, or just the feeling of being stuck. The real problem was the invisible cost of continuing to postpone her own life. For weeks, she did what she always knew how to do well: organized spreadsheets, calculated possibilities, researched courses, compared flight prices, analyzed deadlines, and tried to find the ideal moment to begin any of the 3 changes that could reposition her trajectory: the course that would broaden her education, the trip that would expand her worldview, the professional transition that would bring her closer to something more meaningful. But every time she got close to making a concrete decision, a silent voice would emerge with seemingly rational arguments. It's not the right time. Wait a little longer. Get better organized. When you feel more secure, and Charlotte began to realize that this voice wasn't talking about money. It was talking about fear. Fear of investing in the course and discovering that perhaps she wasn't as talented as she imagined. Fear of traveling alone and realizing she had to face her own company. Fear of changing careers and abandoning the identity she had built with so much effort. What was at stake was not just a financial investment. It was the image she had of herself on an ordinary morning while getting ready for work. Charlotte looked at herself in the mirror with a different kind of attention. She didn't see failure. She didn't see inability. She saw a competent, intelligent, young woman, full of resources, but one who had been treating herself as if she needed permission to experience something greater. This realization was uncomfortable, because if the problem wasn't money, then she needed to admit that she had been using money as an elegant excuse to avoid taking risks. That week, something changed in a practical way. Instead of endlessly searching, Charlotte chose to limit her options. She decided she wouldn't resolve all 3 conflicts at once. She would choose a first step, even if imperfect. Not because I was completely ready, but because he understood that clarity doesn't come before movement. Clarity comes during movement. She reopened the page for the course she had been following for months. She read the entire description without romanticizing it. She did the real calculations, not the idealized ones. She adjusted her budget. She cut superfluous expenses that she maintained more out of habit than necessity. For the first time, the investment stopped seeming impossible and started to seem uncomfortable, and uncomfortable was different from unfeasible. Charlotte realized she had been waiting to feel absolutely safe before acting. An absolute safety is a promise that never arrives. When she closed her laptop that night, she still hadn't clicked buy. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time, the decision wasn't being guided by fear disguised as prudence. She was being guided by a sense of responsibility towards her own future. And that, quietly, was already the beginning of a new version of her. Charlotte stared at the computer screen for a few minutes as if she were facing something bigger than a simple confirmation button. It wasn't just enrolling in a course. It was the symbolic signing of a commitment to a version of herself that she had been postponing for years. The cursor blinked. The value was there. The conditions were clear. There was nothing more to research, compare, or rationalize. And, for the first time, the silence didn't feel like fear. It felt like responsibility. She thought about how many times she had told herself she needed to be better prepared. She thought about the accumulated months of planning without action. She thought about the mental energy spent imagining scenarios instead of actually living any of them. Charlotte understood something she had never clearly admitted. Continuing, as she was also, had a cost. And that cost was invisible because it came disguised as stability. Stability can be comfortable, but when it starts to feel suffocating, it ceases to be security and becomes a prison. She took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to accept the risk. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It is a decision despite it. And that night she wasn't completely sure. She was determined. Charlotte clicked. The almost imperceptible sound of the confirmation seemed too loud in the silent room. An email arrived seconds later. Enrollment complete? For a few moments, nothing happened. The world didn't change. The apartment remained the same. The city continued to be illuminated outside, but inside, something had rearranged itself. The decision brought with it an unexpected wave of anxiety. What if she wasn't able to keep up? What if she had overestimated her own abilities? What if she was romanticizing a change that, in practice, would be more difficult than she imagined? She almost laughed when she realized that fear doesn't disappear after the action. It just changes form. But, unlike other times, fear no longer paralyzed her. He walked beside her. In the following days, Charlotte began the course with a mixture of enthusiasm and vulnerability. She quickly realized there was much more to learn than she had imagined. She felt like a beginner again. She felt exposed. She felt small at times. And, surprisingly, she felt alive. There was something energizing about not completely dominating the territory, about having to think differently, about talking to people who were already a few steps ahead, about realizing that growth isn't comfortable, but it is expansive. At the same time, the decision had practical consequences. She had to reorganize her schedule. She had to say no to invitations she previously accepted out of habit. She had to manage her budget more consciously. She had to stand by her choice on days when her enthusiasm waned. It was at this point that Charlotte understood the difference between impulse and commitment. Impulse is momentary intensity. Commitment is silent constancy. And commitment requires maturity. A week later, as she walked to work, she noticed something subtle. The routine no longer seemed so burdensome. Not because it had changed externally, but because now there was direction. Work was no longer a place where she was trapped, but a strategic step in a larger plan. The course didn't resolve all the conflicts. The desire to travel still existed. The uncertainty about her career wasn't completely resolved, but now she was no longer disoriented. She was in motion, and movement, even when small, has a power that thought alone will never have. Charlotte finally understood that the new direction doesn't emerge as a grand revelation. It begins with a concrete decision, sustained even when emotions waver. And at that stage of life, that was more than enough to keep going. A few weeks after starting the course, Charlotte realized that something much bigger than a new skill was being built within her. The content was important. The intellectual challenges were stimulating. But what was really changing was her relationship with her own ability to make decisions. She no longer saw herself as someone waiting for the perfect moment. She saw herself as someone who creates her own moment. The course didn't eliminate all doubts. There were still difficult days. There was tiredness. There was insecurity. There was the uncomfortable feeling of starting over while other people seemed much more advanced. But for the first time, Charlotte didn't interpret these feelings as signs to retreat. She understood that discomfort is an inevitable part of any expansion. And it was precisely this new attitude that began to affect other areas of her life. The idea of the trip which had previously seemed irresponsible, began to take on a different perspective. Not as an escape, not as a whim, but as a natural extension of someone who was learning to trust herself. She began researching destinations not out of anxiety, but out of curiosity. She started organizing her finances not as a limitation, but as a strategy. She began to view her current career not as a prison, but as a stepping stone. What changed was not the external reality in an immediate way. What changed was the way she positioned herself in relation to it. Charlotte understood that feeling disoriented doesn't mean being lost. It simply means you haven't yet chosen a direction with enough commitment to sustain the journey. When enthusiasm wanes, she also understood that expecting absolute clarity is an elegant trap. Clarity does not precede movement. Clarity is born from it. By taking control of the initial decision, she broke the cycle of paralysis. And when you break that cycle once, you begin to trust that you can break it again. The trip was no longer a distant dream. It became a plan with a deadline. The career transition was no longer a vague thought. It became a concrete possibility that she could evaluate with maturity, not fear. Nothing was solved magically. But everything started to fall into place because she decided to stop hiding. Behind her own prudence, Charlotte finally understood that the life she wanted didn't require a perfect version of herself. It only required a responsible, conscious version, willing to act even when she had doubts. And perhaps that's the most important point of this story. You don't need to resolve all conflicts at once. You need to choose a starting point and stick to that decision when fear tries to negotiate. Back the old comfort zone. If at any point you've identified with Charlotte, if you also feel you want a new direction but are paralyzed between courses, plans, trips, and changes, perhaps the question isn't, what's the best choice? Perhaps the question is, what decision are you postponing out of fear disguised as caution? Write in the comments what the first step is that you've been avoiding taking. Publicly acknowledging this is already a form of commitment. If this story resonated with you, please like this video so it reaches other women who also need to hear that maturity isn't about waiting for absolute security. It's about acting responsibly even when feeling afraid. And if you want to keep following real, profound, and transformative stories like Charlotte's, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize weakness, we explore growth. And growth begins the moment you decide to stop postponing your own life.